Well, Halloween, among other things, is approaching. Again. So I think it's time to look at something horror related. We've already looked at two Scooby-Doo movies and a Looney Tunes DVD of low-budget web cartoons, but this time, let's look at something a little less family-friendly. Let's talk about the franchise of horror and sci-fi movies from Universal Studios that ran for 25 years from 1931 to 1956, known as the Universal Monsters. Of course, for horror movie fans, these movies need no introduction. They are some of the most beloved movies of that genre, from the 1930s all the way up to the 1990s when Universal released them on VHS for a new generation. Of course, being born in 1993, that was too early for me. We have a fair number of things to go through, but of course, we need to start at the beginning. Our edutainment begins in 2010. I'm taking a media studies class in high school, and the first film genre on the study list is classic horror. The class teacher shows us a documentary called Universal Horror, where I learn about classic silent movies such as F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu and Fritz Lang's Metropolis. As it turns out, those two movies in turn led to some inspiration for two iconic horror movies from 1931. After Universal Horror, the teacher puts on Frankenstein. This was the first classic horror movie I ever saw. And what did I think of it? I thought it sucked. I had no idea who Frankenstein was. I had no idea what Frankenstein was. The movie was ancient. It was in black and white. The acting was very weird. There was no music. I was watching on a small TV. I had a lot of problems with this movie. By the time the monster killed Fritz, the movie had lost me. About 10 years later, I decided to give the Frankenstein series another go, which led to me buying the Frankenstein Legacy Collection, which includes 7 films from Frankenstein in 1931 to House of Dracula in 1945. Terrific purchase for a terrific price. It's like what the VHS commercials always said.
Classic monster titles with a haunting new look at a price to die for.
Since they appear in later movies, I also had to watch Dracula and the Wolfman. It's amazing what you can find online. But still, that's only a brief portion of this franchise of 30 plus films. Which leads us to the Universal Monsters 30 film collection, a box set I purchased about 6 months later. A little bit pricier considering I had the damn thing imported from America, but for the amount of content included, it evens out in the end. And then, there's the VHS collection. I saw a trio of VHS tapes, and from there I just couldn't help myself. In a span of a week and a half in early 2021, I found and bought myself 16 VHS tapes, 9 of which are from the Universal Classic Monster Collection. If we're counting only VHS, there's at least 20 in the PAL format, and there are 37 releases in the American collection, and I'm lucky I was able to find 9 of them. I would love to own every single one of them, even just for the artwork, but I barely have room as it is. I have room for maybe 8 more VHS tapes, and if I wanted to keep the Universal Monsters together, I'd have to clean off the bottom 2 shelves, and that most definitely isn't happening. So if you're a Universal Monster lover and you have the space, you absolutely cannot go wrong with owning these on VHS, if only for the artwork, or if you really want the censored version of Frankenstein.
It's alive! Oh, in the name of God! Now I know it!
This is all good shit, but we're going to focus on the 30 film collection box set. If you're a horror movie fanatic and you don't own any of these movies on DVD, you can't go wrong with this. But, if you're on a budget or you already own a Universal Monsters Legacy Collection set, I would look elsewhere. The outer casing looks great, and it may look impressive, especially when it boasts of having 30 films included. On the inside, all this is a compilation box set of 6 legacy collections for each monster, plus a single release for the Phantom of the Opera remake. If you're only interested in 1 or 2 monsters and you don't own any of these, I'd say just get the individual collections and save yourself a bit of money. To provide some context, the 30 film collection cost me £70, including shipping, but normally it would set you back at least $126 for the DVD version and $172 for the Blu-ray, if you really care for HD quality. That being said, if you were to purchase every Legacy collection on its own, it could run you close to £140. So in that regard, unless you already own a few Legacy collections or you only care for a few monsters, you may actually be better off buying the 30 film collection. Did not see that coming. Well, let's take a look at what we have. First on the list is Dracula. 6 films on 4 discs. We have Dracula from 1931, Dracula's Daughter from 1936, Son of Dracula from 1943, and we have House of Frankenstein from 1944, House of Dracula from 1945, and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein from 1948, since Dracula appears in those. There's also the Universal horror documentary and the Spanish version of Dracula, also from 1931. So if you count that as its own thing, there's technically 7 films in this set. Spanish Dracula is easily the most interesting film included in this particular set. In 1931, to appease the foreign language market, in the days before audio dubbing became a normal practice, Universal shot 2 versions of Dracula, one for English audiences starring Bela Lugosi, and another for Spanish audiences starring Carlos Villarreal. While on paper it may just look like a carbon copy of Lugosi's Dracula, and while both films use the same script and sets, the Spanish version has a completely different cast, is more artistically well made, and is 29 minutes longer, featuring content not seen in the English version. A common debate when it comes to horror is which is better, Lugosi Dracula or Spanish Dracula. Since I don't speak a word of Spanish, I'll always pick the English version. Despite it being very stagey and hokey, Bela Lugosi is the definitive Dracula for me. Although Spanish definitely has its highlights, my favourite of which involves Dracula turning into mist. Next, Frankenstein. This one has 8 films on 4 discs, including Frankenstein from 1931, Bride of Frankenstein from 1935, Son of Frankenstein from 1939, The Ghost of Frankenstein from 1942, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman from 1943, House of Frankenstein, yes there are duplicates here, House of Dracula, and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. That's another thing you need to be aware of if you're buying this. You're getting 1 duplicate between Frankenstein and the Wolfman, and a further 3 when you include Dracula. Anyway, number 3 in the collection. The Mummy. 6 films on only 3 discs. The Mummy from 1932, The Mummy's Hand from 1940, The Mummy's Tomb from 1942, The Mummy's Ghost and The Mummy's Curse, both from 1944, and Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy because, of course, they need to meet every monster. Next, The Invisible Man. Rinse and repeat, 6 films on 3 discs. This one has The Invisible Man from 1933, The Invisible Man Returns and The Invisible Woman from 1940, Invisible Agent from 1942, The Invisible Man's Revenge from 1944, and Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man from 1951. The Wolfman, probably the most irrelevant Legacy collection when you have them all together. 7 films on 4 discs. We have The Wolfman from 1941, and then we have Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, and Abbott and Costello. Yep, those last 3 have 3 monsters, so it has to be on 3 Legacy collections. And then on the last disc, there's Werewolf of London from 1935 and She-Wolf of London from 1946, both of which are unrelated to the Wolfman. If you only care about Larry Talbot and you already own the Frankenstein Legacy collection, just buy the Wolfman on its own. Next, The Phantom of the Opera. 1 film on 1 disc. All this is the 1943 colour remake of the 1925 silent film starring Lon Chaney, which surprisingly is not included as a bonus feature. They included Spanish Dracula, but not this, arguably one of the most iconic silent films ever made. Okay. Finally, Creature from the Black Lagoon. 3 movies on 2 discs. Creature from the Black Lagoon from 1954, Revenge of the Creature from 1955, and The Creature Walks Among Us from 1956. Nice and consistent, and no crappy comedy movies like with The Mummy. It also comes with a booklet with info on the movies and the cast and crew. You'll read it once, and that'll be it. Now suppose you buy this and you don't know where to start. Suppose it's your first time watching these movies. Do you go chronological or by character? With that, I'm here to help. Let me give you some optional viewing methods. If you have to start anywhere, start with Frankenstein, arguably the most iconic film in the entire Universal Monsters catalogue. If you liked Frankenstein, move on to the other original monster movies, them being Dracula, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, The Wolfman, and Creature from the Black Lagoon, and the Phantom of the Opera remake. I haven't seen the original Phantom with Lon Chaney, so I don't know how it compares, but even without that, I'd say Phantom 43 is the least important out of the initial lineup. I'd also recommend Bride of Frankenstein, which essentially acts as Frankenstein Part 2. If you enjoyed any of the originals, check out the subsequent movies in whichever series you enjoyed, including Spanish Dracula and 2 of the Abbott and Costello movies, only 2 of them. For Frankenstein, I'd say watch up to Ghost of Frankenstein. That one is hit or miss, but I personally like it, if only for Bela Lugosi's performance as Igor. It has a B-movie feel, the stakes are definitely lower than the previous movies, but it does have a great climax.
I have the strength of 100 men. I cannot die. I cannot be destroyed. I, Igor, will live forever.
When it comes to the series overall, Son of Frankenstein is my favourite Frankenstein movie, and quite possibly my favourite film in the entire franchise. But if you don't like Son or Ghost, at least you've seen the 2 main ones. The Mummy. All 4 sequels are very B-movie, and quality can vary with each one. The first one is more comedic action-adventure, and the remaining 3 could pass for crappy slasher movies. If you have to see one, see The Mummy's Hand. It's entertaining and light-hearted, and all 4 movies are barely an hour long, which helps if B-movie slashers aren't your thing.
30 years ago, an infidel sought to destroy me and to destroy Caris.
Also, The Mummy's Tomb and The Mummy's Ghost take place in 1970, 30 years after The Mummy's Hand, which takes place in 1940, and The Mummy's Curse takes place in 1995, 25 years after Tomb and Ghost. Just ignore that minor detail, it's hardly noticeable. The Invisible Man. The main one to see after the original is The Invisible Man Returns, starring Vincent Price. It's not as good as the original, but it definitely does a lot of things right. As for the rest of them, Invisible Woman was a brainless comedy, Invisible Agent was watchable wartime propaganda, and Invisible Man's Revenge was stale and kinda dull. The Wolfman never had any actual sequels, so here we have several options. If you like werewolves, watch Werewolf of London. If you can handle B-movie crossovers, watch House of Frankenstein. If you want a movie that's a complete afterthought with a budget so small the ending of another movie had to be used, watch House of Dracula. And if you can handle a butchered mess, watch Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. That one is more of a Wolfman movie than a Frankenstein movie. Thanks to some executive interference and some last-minute cuts, the Frankenstein monster appears in barely 5 minutes, and the rest is all about Larry Talbot. If you're watching casually, you could honestly forget this movie was Frankenstein related.
No, it's me.
Then there's She-Wolf of London. For some reason, this movie is included in the collection, despite there being the minor problem of there being no werewolves anywhere in the movie. She-Wolf is more of a murder mystery movie, and after you watch it once and learn there is nothing even remotely resembling a werewolf in the movie, you'll never want to watch it again. Instead of there being a werewolf, the main character's aunt commits the film's murders in order to have the main character committed to a mental asylum. That's all. Her housekeeper overhears her diabolical plans, and when the aunt tries to kill her, she trips on the stairs and impales herself on her own fucking knife. When you realize the title is a complete lie, this is easily the most boring movie in the entire set. It doesn't even belong in the Universal Monsters lineup. Finally, there's Creature from the Black Lagoon. The first film is easily the best, but the sequels work fine, just don't expect much. The title Revenge of the Creature doesn't necessarily make sense, as each film is a standalone release with little to no relation to each other, but hey, you gotta have a catchy title. This is a good movie to watch if you want a sympathetic creature, similar to the monster in Bride of Frankenstein. It has a few bad effects here and there, and the final shot is recycled from the first movie, but this one is pretty good. As for the creature walks among us, that one is pretty average until the last 15 minutes when the evolving creature gets loose. And that's it. Like I said, start with Frankenstein and see where that leads you. So that's the Universal Monsters 30 film collection. A great collection of films, but I do have some issues. First of all, Werewolf of London has got to go. It has no business being included. If we're keeping it at 30 films, we need something to replace it. Most classic horror movie lovers would probably point towards The Black Cat and The Raven, which are both great movies with Karloff and Lugosi. But if we're being technical, there isn't a monster per se in those movies. After looking through and watching a few other movies in the classic monster collection, I have two options. Man-Made Monster from 1941 starring Lon Chaney Jr. or The Mad Ghoul from 1943 starring George Zucco from The Mummy's Hand. Neither of them are great movies, but they fit the monster criteria. The Mad Ghoul has zombies and Man-Made Monster has an electric mutant. Where you'd include the Mad Ghoul, I'm not sure, but with Man-Made Monster, you can include that in the Frankenstein collection. It has as much relation as Werewolf and She-Wolf of London have to the Wolfman. One more minor complaint relating to movie organisation. The packaging. It's not as bad as the George Carlin commemorative collection, which was broken when I opened it, but it is a little lacking. The outer shell actually looks pretty good, as does the back, which has a list of all the movies and additional bonus features. My issue is with the discs. This applies mostly to the DVD version. The Blu-ray discs look a little bit better, but on DVD they're very plain. Basic text on a black background with no artwork. For the amount of money spent on this box set, they could do better. What I think would make it look better would be something akin to the MCU Infinity box sets, individual discs or even multi-feature discs with artwork to accompany it. Maybe artwork similar to the VHS releases. Release the movies in order of release date with 1, 2 or even 3 movies if they're super short, and you've got a winning formula. Separate them into multiple volumes if need be. Monster fans will still go for it. With all that being said, I give the 30 film collection a 4 out of 5, and it goes to number 28 in the rankings, ahead of The Emperor's New Groove and Bad Day at Cat Rock, and behind George Carlin and Christmas Looney Tunes. Well, that's that. Today's been a busy day. A very busy day. One that will surely change my life forever. And now, it's behind me. Life may be moving on, but to round out the year, let's take a look at that old staple from my youthful days.